My stepfather tried to erase me from the family, to give my inheritance to his son, so I planned my revenge, and now they are begging. I never thought I'd be writing this story, but after everything that's happened over the past 18 months, I need to get this out there. Maybe it'll help someone else going through something similar, or maybe I just need to process what my own family put me through after my mother died. I 34 male, and my mother passed away from cancer last year. What should have been a time for our family to come together and grieve became the most toxic, manipulative nightmare I've ever experienced. My stepfather, who I'll call Richard, decided that my mother's death was the perfect opportunity to rewrite our entire family history and erase me from it completely. Let me give you some background. My biological father died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. My mother, Sarah, was devastated, but did her best to raise me alone for 3 years. When I was 11, she met Richard at her work. He seemed like a decent guy back then. He was kind to me, included me in activities, and genuinely seemed to care about both of us. They got married when I was 13, and a year later, my half-brother Connor was born. I want to be clear about something from the start. I loved my mother more than anything in this world. She was my rock, my best friend, and the one person who always had my back. Even after Richard came into our lives, even after Connor was born, she never made me feel like I was less important or less loved. She always made sure I knew that I was her firstborn, her special boy, and that nothing would ever change that. Richard and I had what I thought was a decent relationship growing up. Sure, he could never replace my real dad, but he provided for us, he came to my school events, and he treated me fairly. Or at least, that's what I believed at the time. Looking back now with adult eyes, I can see the subtle ways he always favored Connor. The extra praise, the better gifts, the way he'd light up when Connor entered a room versus the polite acknowledgement I'd get. But my mother's love was so strong and constant that it overshadowed any doubts I might have had. Connor and I had a typical sibling relationship. We fought sometimes, played together other times, but overall got along reasonably well. He was 7 years younger than me, so by the time he was becoming a teenager, I was already in college. We weren't super close, but there wasn't any major animosity either. At least, not that I was aware of. I went to college about 4 hours away from home, studying engineering. My mother was so proud. She came to my graduation, took a million pictures, and kept telling everyone about her son, the engineer. Richard was there too, and he seemed proud as well, though I noticed even then that he spent more time talking about Connor's potential future than celebrating my actual achievements. After college, I got a good job in the same city where I'd gone to school. I loved it there, had built a life, met my girlfriend Jessica, and was doing well for myself. I visited home regularly, probably once a month or so, and my mom and I talked on the phone at least twice a week. She'd always ask about work, about Jessica, about when I might propose. She was so excited about the possibility of grandchildren someday. Richard and I maintained a cordial relationship during this time. We weren't super close, but we got along fine. He'd ask about my job, we'd watch football together when I visited. Normal stuff. Connor was finishing high school and had been accepted to a local community college. He wasn't the best student. Frankly, he was pretty lazy and had gotten by mostly on charm and Richard making excuses for him. But my mother loved him dearly, as she should have. He was her baby, and despite not being as academically inclined as I was, he was still a good kid overall. Everything changed when my mother got sick. It started with her feeling tired all the time. She kept saying she was just getting older, that work was stressing her out, the usual excuses people make when they don't want to acknowledge that something might be seriously wrong. But I knew my mother, and this wasn't normal for her. I begged her to see a doctor during one of my visits home, and she finally agreed. The diagnosis hit us like a freight train. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. If you know anything about pancreatic cancer, you know it's basically a death sentence. The survival rates are horrible, and by the time it's detected, it's usually too late for any meaningful treatment. The doctors were honest with us. She probably had 6 months to a year if she was lucky. I immediately asked my boss for extended leave and moved back home to help take care of her. Jessica was incredible during this time. She helped me pack up my apartment, found someone to sublet it, and even considered moving with me before we decided it would be better for her to keep her job and visit on weekends. The plan was for me to stay as long as necessary to help my mom through this. Those months taking care of my mother were simultaneously the most precious and the most heartbreaking of my life. We spent hours talking about everything: her childhood, my father, her hopes for my future, her worries about Connor. She told me stories I'd never heard before, shared fears and dreams she'd never voiced. We watched her favorite movies together, cooked her favorite meals when she felt up to eating, and just treasured every moment we had left. During this time, I started noticing things about Richard and Connor that troubled me. Richard seemed almost relieved that I was there handling most of the day-to-day caregiving. He'd go to work, come home, spend maybe an hour with my mom, then retreat to his den to watch TV or play on his computer. When I'd suggest he spend more time with her, he'd get defensive and say he was dealing with his grief in his own way. Connor was even worse. He was 19 at this point, old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, but he acted like nothing was happening. He'd barely visit with mom, wouldn't help with her medications or doctor's appointments, and seemed more concerned with his social life than with the fact that his mother was dying. When I confronted him about it, he'd get angry and say I was trying to be his dad, that he didn't have to listen to me. My mother noticed it too. During one of our late-night conversations, she broke down crying and told me how grateful she was that I was there, how scared she was about leaving Connor, because he seemed so immature and irresponsible. She worried that Richard would baby him even more after she was gone, and that Connor would never learn to stand on his own feet. "Promise me," she said, gripping my hand with what little strength she had left. "Promise me you'll keep an eye on Connor after I'm gone. Help guide him. Be the big brother he needs. Richard means well, but he's too soft with him. Connor needs someone like you to help him grow up." I promised her I would. I meant it completely. As her condition worsened, my mother started talking more about practical matters. She'd already made a will years earlier, but she wanted to update it. She asked me to drive her to her lawyer's office. She insisted on going in person, rather than having someone come to the house, because she said it was too important to leave any room for misunderstanding. I sat in the waiting room while she met with her attorney for over 2 hours. When she came out, she looked exhausted but relieved. She wouldn't tell me exactly what changes she'd made, but she did say that she'd made sure both Connor and I would be taken care of, and that she'd left specific instructions about some family heirlooms that were important to her. "Your father gave me my engagement ring before you were born," she told me on the drive home. "It's been in his family for 3 generations. When you're ready to propose to Jessica, I want you to have it. And there are photo albums and keepsakes from your childhood that I want you to keep. These things are part of your history, your connection to your real father. I've made sure they'll come to you." She also told me that she'd made provisions for Connor's college expenses and that Richard would inherit the house, which seemed fair since he'd been paying the mortgage for years. She said she'd tried to balance everything fairly while making sure I maintained my connection to my father's memory and our shared history. My mother passed away on a Tuesday morning in October. I was holding her hand when she died. Richard was there too, and Connor arrived about 20 minutes later. We all cried together, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe this tragedy would bring our family closer together. I was so incredibly wrong. The funeral was beautiful. My mother had planned most of it herself, wanting to spare us the difficult decisions. She was buried next to my biological father, as she'd always said she wanted. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects. She'd touched so many lives throughout her career and in our community. During the funeral, Richard gave a speech about what a wonderful wife and mother she'd been. But I started noticing something strange in his words. He talked extensively about her role as Connor's mother, about how proud she was of Connor, about Connor's bright future. When he mentioned me, it was almost as an afterthought. And of course, she loved both her boys, with no specific details or personal anecdotes. At the time, I chalked it up to grief. People process loss differently, and maybe Richard was just focused on Connor because Connor was still living at home and would need more support. The first real red flag came about a week after the funeral. Jessica had gone back to her job, and I was staying at the house to help with estate matters and to be there for Connor. Richard approached me and said we needed to talk about practical matters. He sat me down at the kitchen table and pulled out a folder of documents. "Your mother's will is pretty straightforward," he said. "The house comes to me, obviously, since I've been paying for it. There's a small college fund she set up for Connor, and she left some personal items to be divided between you boys." I asked to see the will itself, and Richard's expression immediately shifted. "You don't need to see all the legal paperwork," he said, suddenly defensive. "I'm just giving you the overview. The lawyer will send you a copy of anything relevant to you." This struck me as odd. Why wouldn't I be allowed to see my mother's will? But again, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just trying to protect me from having to deal with legal complexities while I was grieving. Over the next few weeks, though, Richard's behavior became increasingly strange and troubling. He started going through my mother's belongings with what seemed like frantic urgency, sorting things into boxes and labeling them. When I offered to help or asked what he was doing, he'd become evasive and territorial. "I'm just organizing things," he'd say. "It's too painful for me to do this with other people around. I need to process this in my own way." But I could see what he was doing, and it didn't look like grieving to me. It looked like he was systematically going through everything and deciding what to keep, what to throw away, and well, I wasn't sure what else he was doing with things. The breaking point came about 3 weeks after the funeral. I came home from running errands to find Richard in my mother's bedroom, going through her jewelry box. This wasn't just casual sorting. He had pieces laid out on the bed in organized groups, and he was making notes on a legal pad. "What are you doing with Mom's jewelry?" I asked. He looked up, startled, and quickly started putting things back in the jewelry box. "Just cataloging things for insurance purposes," he said, but his tone was defensive and guilty. "Where's my father's engagement ring?" I asked. "Mom specifically told me she wanted me to have it." Richard's face went completely blank. "What engagement ring?" "The one my biological father gave her. She wore it on a chain around her neck sometimes. She told me it was a family heirloom, and that she wanted me to have it when I was ready to propose." "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Your mother never had any jewelry from her first husband. You must be misremembering." I stared at him in disbelief. "Richard, I saw her wear that ring hundreds of times. She told me the story behind it just a few weeks ago. She specifically said it would come to me." "You're being dramatic," he said, closing the jewelry box firmly. "Grief can make people imagine things that weren't real. Your mother never mentioned any ring to me." This was when I realized that something was seriously wrong. My mother had definitely talked to me about that ring multiple times over the years, not just during her final weeks, and Richard's sudden claim that he'd never heard of it was obviously a lie. That evening, I called my mother's attorney. I explained who I was and asked if I could get a copy of her will. The receptionist was polite, but said they could only release documents to the executor of the estate. "Who is the executor?" I asked. "Let me check. That would be Richard Thompson. I'm her son. Surely I have a right to see my mother's will. I understand your situation, but legally, we can only work directly with the designated executor unless he provides written authorization for us to speak with you." This was getting more suspicious by the minute. Why would Richard be stonewalling me from seeing the will if everything was as straightforward as he claimed? I decided to approach Richard directly. That evening, I asked him again to see the will. "Why do you need to see it?" he asked, immediately on the defensive. "Because she was my mother too, and I want to understand what her final wishes were. I want to make sure we're handling things the way she wanted. I already told you what she wanted. You don't trust me?" "It's not about trust, Richard. I just want to see the document myself. Surely you can understand that." Richard stood up abruptly. "I think you're getting a little too involved in matters that don't concern you. Your mother left you some personal items, and you'll get them when I'm ready to distribute things. Beyond that, this isn't really your business." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How is my mother's will not my business? "I'm her son." "You're her son from her first marriage," Richard said, and there was something cold in his voice that I'd never heard before. "Connor and I are her real family. This house, this estate, these decisions, they're family matters." The way he said "her first marriage," like it was somehow less legitimate, less important, made my blood boil. But more than that, his implication that I wasn't real family was like a slap in the face. "My mother never treated me like I was less family than Connor," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "Your mother felt sorry for you because your father died," Richard replied. "But that doesn't make you entitled to our family's inheritance. Our family's inheritance. Not my mother's estate, not our shared inheritance. His and Connor's inheritance." That night, I barely slept. Everything Richard had said kept playing over and over in my mind. The way he'd claimed not to know about my father's ring. The way he'd refused to let me see the will. The way he'd talked about real family like I didn't belong. The next morning, Connor came home from staying at a friend's house. I decided to talk to him, hoping he might be more reasonable than his father. I found him in the kitchen making breakfast. "Hey Connor, can we talk for a minute?" He shrugged. "Sure, what's up?" "I'm having some concerns about how your dad is handling Mom's estate. Have you seen her will?" Connor's expression immediately became guarded. "Why would I need to see it? Dad's taking care of everything. Don't you want to know what her final wishes were? What she wanted for both of us?" "She wanted me to go to college and be successful," Connor said. "Dad told me she left money for my education. That's all I need to know." "What about family heirlooms? Photos from when I was little? Things that belonged to my biological father?" Connor actually laughed. "Dude, why are you so obsessed with that stuff? That's all ancient history. Mom moved on from your dad a long time ago. Her real life was with our dad and with me." The way he said "our dad" was clearly intentional, emphasizing that Richard was his father, but not mine. And his dismissal of my biological father as ancient history was incredibly hurtful. Connor, those things are part of my history too. Mom always said she wanted me to have them. Maybe she said that to make you feel better. But come on, why would she leave that stuff to you when I'm the one who's actually family? There it was again. Actually family. Like my relationship with our mother was somehow fake, or less legitimate, because I didn't share DNA with Richard. I lived in this house for 6 years, I said, my voice rising. She was my mother for 26 years before you were even born. How does that make me less family? Connor rolled his eyes. Look, I get that you're upset about Mom dying, but you need to stop trying to cause drama. Dad's handling everything the way Mom wanted. You should be grateful he's not charging you rent for staying here. Charging me rent? For staying in what had been my family home? For helping to take care of our dying mother? That afternoon, I made a decision. I needed to get legal advice of my own. I found a family law attorney in town and made an appointment for the following week. In the meantime, I decided to do some investigation on my own. I started by going through my mother's desk in her home office. Richard had been through here too, I could tell, but maybe he'd missed something. In the back of one drawer, I found a business card for her attorney with some handwritten notes on the back. The notes mentioned trust provisions and protecting heirlooms, and something about ensuring biological son's connection to first husband's memory. This was evidence that my mother had indeed been thinking about preserving my connection to my biological father. Whatever Richard was telling me about her wishes didn't match up with these notes. I also found a small key taped to the underside of her desk drawer. It looked like it might go to a safety deposit box or filing cabinet, but I couldn't figure out what it opened. I kept it anyway, thinking it might be important later. That weekend, Connor had some friends over, and I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. I was upstairs, and they were in the living room below, so they didn't realize I could hear them. Yeah, my dad says we'll probably sell this place and get something smaller, Connor was saying. It's too big for just the two of us, and we could use the money. What about your brother? One of his friends asked. Connor laughed. He's not actually my brother. He's just some guy my mom was stuck with from her first marriage. Dad says he'll probably move back to his old city once we get this estate stuff sorted out. That's cold, man. Not really. I mean, he's not actually family. It would be weird if he stuck around, you know? This was never really his home anyway. Hearing Connor dismiss me so casually, hearing him refer to me as just some guy his mother was stuck with, was devastating. But it also revealed something important. Richard and Connor had clearly discussed this. They'd made plans that involved me leaving and being excluded from the family. More than that, Connor's comment about selling the house was troubling. If Richard had inherited the house as he claimed, he certainly had the right to sell it. But something about the way Connor talked about it suggested they were eager to liquidize everything quickly. The following Monday, I met with the attorney I'd contacted. Her name was Patricia Williams, and she specialized in estate and probate law. I explained my situation, my mother's death, my stepfather's refusal to show me the will, the concerning comments I'd overheard, and my suspicion that something wasn't right. The first thing we need to do is get a copy of the will, Patricia said. In this state, wills are public record once they've been filed with the probate court. Let me make some calls and see what I can find out. She called me back that afternoon. I have good news and bad news, she said. The good news is that your mother's will was filed with the probate court last week, so I can get a copy. The bad news is that there are some irregularities I want to investigate before we proceed. What kind of irregularities? Well, the will is dated only 2 weeks before your mother's death. That's not necessarily suspicious by itself, but given your description of her condition at that time, I want to make sure she was competent to make such significant changes so close to the end. Changes? What changes? I thought she updated her will months ago, I said. She took a trip to her lawyer's office while she was still relatively healthy. According to the court filing, this will is dated October 15th. When did your mother pass away? October 30th. So this will was created just 2 weeks before her death. Do you know if she met with her attorney again during that time period? I thought back through those final weeks. My mother had been bedridden for the last month of her life. There was no way she could have made a trip to a lawyer's office in mid-October. No, she didn't leave the house during that time. She was too sick to go anywhere. Then either the attorney came to her or... Patricia paused. Let me get a copy of this will and review it carefully. Can you meet with me again tomorrow afternoon? That night was one of the longest of my life. I kept trying to make sense of what Patricia had told me. If my mother hadn't left the house in her final weeks, how had she executed a new will on October 15th? And why would she make major changes so close to her death when she'd seemed satisfied with the arrangements she'd made months earlier? The next afternoon, Patricia's expression was grave when I arrived at her office. I've reviewed the will and I have serious concerns, she said, sliding a copy across the desk to me. Before you read it, I want you to know that I think there are grounds to challenge this document. I picked up the will with trembling hands and started reading. What I found was devastating. According to this document, my mother left the house to Richard, as expected. She left Connor's college fund to Connor, also expected. But everything else, her personal belongings, her jewelry, her photo albums, her keepsakes, even items that had specifically belonged to my biological father, everything was left to Connor. There was no mention of my father's engagement ring, no mention of the photo albums from my childhood, no mention of preserving any connection between me and my biological father's memory. According to this will, I was to receive a token bequest of $5,000 and nothing else. But the most shocking part was a paragraph near the end that I had to read 3 times before it sank in. I want to express my gratitude to my stepson for his care during my illness, but I believe it is important for my biological son to inherit the family legacy and maintain the family history. Connor represents the future of our family name, and these possessions should remain with him and his descendants. It was like a knife to the heart. This didn't sound anything like my mother. She would never have referred to Connor as representing our family name when she'd kept my biological father's name throughout her entire marriage to Richard. She would never have dismissed my role in the family so coldly. This doesn't sound like her, I told Patricia, my voice shaking. I agree. The language is very formal and legalistic, which is unusual for personal bequests. Most people write these sections in their own voice. But more concerning are the factual errors. What factual errors? Patricia pointed to several lines in the document. The will refers to our family home that she and Richard purchased together. But according to public records, your mother owned this house before her marriage to Richard. He was added to the deed later, but she was the original owner. She pointed to another section. It also refers to jewelry we collected together during our marriage. But you've described family heirlooms from her first marriage that she specifically wanted you to have. So what do you think happened? Patricia leaned back in her chair. I think someone either coerced your mother into signing this will when she wasn't competent to understand what she was signing, or, she paused, looking uncomfortable. Or what? Or, this will is a forgery. The room seemed to spin around me. You think Richard forged my mother's will? I think it's a possibility we need to investigate. The timing is suspicious. 2 weeks before her death when you say she was bedridden and not meeting with attorneys. The language doesn't match what you've described of her intentions. And the factual errors suggest someone who didn't have complete knowledge of her actual assets and history. Patricia recommended that we hire a handwriting expert to analyze the signature and that we request copies of any security footage from the attorney's office around the time the will was supposedly executed. She also wanted to interview the attorney who supposedly witnessed the signing. This is going to be expensive and time-consuming, she warned me. And there's no guarantee we can prove anything. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my mother's promise that she'd preserve my connection to my biological father. I thought about her telling me she'd made provisions for the family heirlooms. I thought about Richard's lies and Connor's dismissive attitude. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. The investigation took 3 months and was every bit as expensive as Patricia had warned, but the results were worth it. The handwriting expert concluded that the signature on the October 15th will was highly inconsistent, with verified samples of my mother's handwriting from the same time period. More damning, the attorney who supposedly witnessed the signing had no record of a meeting with my mother on that date and specifically remembered that the last time he saw her was during the visit I'd driven her to months earlier. Most importantly, we discovered that Richard had called the attorney's office on October 16th, the day after the will was supposedly signed, asking about procedures for filing estate documents after a death. This suggested advance planning that was highly suspicious. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. The key I'd found in my mother's desk opened a safety deposit box I'd never known about. Inside, we found the original will she'd executed during our trip to the attorney months earlier. This will was completely different from the one Richard had filed with the court. In her true will, my mother had left the house jointly to Richard and me, with the understanding that I could buy out his share if I wanted to return home permanently, or that we'd split the proceeds if the house was sold. She'd left specific instructions that I was to receive all items connected to my biological father, including his engagement ring, family photos, and personal effects she'd preserved. She'd also left instructions that family photo albums and mementos from my childhood were to be given to me to preserve for my future children. Most importantly, there was a letter sealed in an envelope marked, "To my firstborn son." Inside, my mother had written, "My dearest son, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and something has happened to prevent you from receiving what I intended for you. I want you to know that you have been the joy of my life from the moment you were born.
Your father would be so proud of the man you've become. I have tried to balance my love for both my sons while ensuring that your connection to your father's memory is preserved. The items I've left for you are not just possessions. They are pieces of your history, your identity, your legacy. Don't let anyone convince you that you matter less or that your place in this family is less important. You were my first baby, my first love, and no subsequent relationships could ever diminish that. Fight for what belongs to you, not because of the monetary value, but because these things represent your father's love for me and my love for you. I cried for an hour after reading that letter. Armed with this evidence, Patricia filed a motion to invalidate the forged will and probate the real one. She also filed a complaint with the police alleging forgery and fraud. Richard's response was immediate and vicious.
He hired an expensive attorney and claimed that I had forged the documents in the safety deposit box. He alleged that I was trying to steal money from Connor's inheritance out of jealousy and resentment. Connor fully supported his father's claims. He actually gave a statement to Richard's attorney saying that I had always been bitter about not being Richard's biological son, and that I'd been acting erratically since our mother's death. He claimed I'd been making unreasonable demands for family heirlooms that weren't rightfully mine. The gaslighting was intense. Richard and Connor enlisted several of their friends and some extended family members to support their version of events. They painted me as a greedy stepson, trying to take advantage of a grieving family. They spread rumors that I'd been financially irresponsible and was only interested in my mother's estate to pay off debts. None of this was true, but the campaign was effective. People who had known our family for years started looking at me suspiciously. Some of my mother's friends actually confronted me at the grocery store, accusing me of dishonoring her memory by attacking Richard during his time of grief. The legal battle dragged on for 8 months. During this time, I had to move out of the family home because the atmosphere became completely toxic. Richard changed the locks and claimed I was trespassing. Connor sent me threatening text messages telling me to drop the lawsuit or face consequences. The worst part was the isolation. Most of our extended family sided with Richard and Connor, either because they believed the lies or because they didn't want to get involved in the drama. I felt like I was fighting for my mother's memory and my own identity completely alone. Jessica was incredibly supportive during this time, but the stress put a strain on our relationship too. She couldn't understand why I was putting myself through such an ordeal for what some people viewed as just stuff. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the monetary value of the items. It was about preserving my connection to my parents and refusing to be erased from my own family history. The breakthrough came when Patricia's investigator uncovered evidence of Richard's planning. Cell phone records showed that Richard had made multiple calls to estate planning services in the weeks before my mother's death. More damning, they found an email draft on Richard's computer, discovered during the legal discovery process, that was nearly identical to the language used in the forged will. Faced with this evidence, Richard's attorney advised him to settle rather than risk criminal prosecution. In the end, Richard agreed to probate my mother's real will and to return all the items that had been rightfully left to me. When I finally received the boxes containing my inheritance, I understood why Richard had been so determined to keep them from me. These weren't just random personal effects. My mother had carefully preserved everything that connected me to my biological father. Not just his engagement ring, but letters he'd written to her during their courtship, photos of their wedding, even the hospital bracelet from when I was born. She'd also kept meticulous photo albums documenting my childhood, report cards and school projects I'd made, Father's Day cards I'd given to my biological dad before he died. This was a complete record of my life and my place in the family history. But perhaps most importantly, I found documents showing that my biological father had started a small investment account for my education before he died. My mother had continued contributing to it over the years, and it had grown substantially. This was apparently what Richard had been most eager to hide, not just sentimental items, but a significant financial legacy that my mother had always intended for me. The final resolution came almost exactly 18 months after my mother's death. Richard was forced to honor the terms of the real will, which meant selling the house and splitting the proceeds with me. Connor received his college fund as intended, but lost out on all the additional inheritance he'd thought he was getting from the forged will. More satisfying than the financial outcome was the vindication. The truth came out, and people who had initially supported Richard and Connor began to understand what had really happened. Several family friends and relatives reached out to apologize for doubting me. Richard and Connor never apologized, of course. To this day, they maintain that I somehow orchestrated an elaborate fraud to steal their inheritance. Connor actually posted on social media claiming that I had destroyed the family and that my mother would be ashamed of me. But I know the truth. I have my mother's letter, her real will, and all the proof I need that she loved me, valued my place in the family, and wanted to preserve my connection to my biological father's memory. I used part of my inheritance to buy a house in the city where I'd been living before Mom got sick. Jessica and I got engaged, using my father's ring just as my mother had intended. We're planning a wedding for next spring.